Harold Holzer joins us to talk about President Abraham Lincoln's influence on modern politics. Mr. Holzer is a scholar and author, and the author of Lincoln, How Abraham Lincoln Ended Slavery in America, and he's also a Hertog Fellow at the New York Historical Society. Thank you for being on the program.
My pleasure.
So tell us, why is President Lincoln, why does it seem like he's more popular not only among political leaders than he was in the past, but also among the general American public?
Well, I think the Spielberg factor is certainly at work here in a major way. The movie has been a huge commercial success, aside from the critical acclaim it's attracted, and it seems to have lifted all boats as far as the discussion and the scholarship. President Obama had a screening at the White House that was widely publicized, and then the Senate had a screening just 4 or 5 weeks ago, which I was lucky enough to attend, and that was a pretty amazing experience.
Lincoln seems to be being invoked by today's political leaders more often. What was it about his administration that these people, both in the Senate and in the White House, are looking for? What kind of lessons, what kind of patterns were set up by the Lincoln administration that still hold up today?
Well, this is not a new phenomenon, because if you go back even to the 19th century, Republicans and Democrats have been feuding over who has the best claim on Lincoln's legacy ever since Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson and William Howard Taft all battled about it. Really in 1912 is when the bipartisan or multi-partisan battle began. FDR, TR, Clinton, Bush. It's extraordinary. And what they, I think, all believe that Lincoln shows them is the ability to succeed in a crisis. Lincoln obviously faced the worst crisis in American history and had a recalcitrant Congress, which is not a new phenomenon, and despite all of that managed to steer us to preserving the Union and ending slavery. So he's a model of success under pressure, and success, unfortunately, that came with a great cost.
Harold Holzer is our guest. He is a scholar and author of Lincoln, How Abraham Lincoln Ended Slavery in America. And if you want to get involved in our conversation regarding President Lincoln's influence on modern politics, the number is 202-585-3880 for Democrats, 202-585-3881 for Republicans, and 202-585-3882 for Independents. You can also reach out and touch us via social media. So, Harold Holzer, tell us, regarding President Lincoln, how would he handle, in your opinion, today's fights like sequestration and the partisan battles that are going on between the different houses of Congress and between Congress and the White House?
However bad the red and blue, or the blue and red combination is, got to get this right because the aphorism flips, blue and gray is worse, obviously, because partisanship led to shooting wars in the 1850s, in Kansas and Harper's Ferry and other places, and ultimately throughout the country. So, for all of our acknowledgement that Lincoln steered us through a crisis, he was unable to achieve results in a fully national Congress. He had just as much trouble as President Obama is having. The only way that, for example, that the 13th Amendment passed is because only northern congressmen and senators voted for it. The rest of them were no longer participating in Congress. And it was still hard to get the 2/3 vote. It's hard to know what the answer is. What Lincoln did that is the model and has become the model for presidents in the modern age is go directly to the people. He didn't make speeches, he didn't hold press conferences, obviously didn't do television opportunities, but he did issue statements, what were called public letters, trying to get the country behind his agenda, which in very large measure, and this is another thing we need to keep in mind, Abraham Lincoln didn't achieve his greatest successes through the legislative process. He did them by presidential order, both good and questionable. The Emancipation Proclamation was a military order by the chief executive, by the commander-in-chief. His limitations on the privileges of the writ of habeas corpus were presidential orders, later ratified by Congress. The whole run-up to the beginning of the Civil War, calling up troops, allocating funds, he did while Congress was not in session. Maybe that's the lesson. Wait till Congress is out and then do your thing.
Professor Holzer is a scholar who has spent 4 decades studying President Lincoln, and we'll be talking about President Lincoln's surge in popularity and what Lincoln's political legacy means in modern times. We're going to go to the phones and take some calls for Harold Holzer. The first one comes from Paul in Indianapolis, Indiana, on our line for Independence. Paul, you there?
Good morning, and this is a great topic for discussion. It seems to me that we often hear that Lincoln was both against slavery and a racist, but aren't the two shouldn't be conflated, because it seems to me that slavery is a very ancient institution. Hammurabi dealt with slavery, whereas the scientific racism or social Darwinism that ultimately ended in such horrors as Auschwitz was a much more recent phenomenon. And it seems to me that Lincoln got in on the tail end of the opposition of slavery, which didn't end in China until 1954, but he got in on the real start of the scientific racism, unquote, which twisted Western thought up into, ended up in, what's it called, the eugenics and that kind of thing. So it seems to me that there's actually two different issues. Lincoln could very easily have been a racist but still hate the institution of slavery.
Harold Holzer.
Indianapolis, a great Lincoln town, by the way. Wonderful collection there. Let me just address all that you said in Lincoln's terms and in Lincoln's world. He was, as he put it, always anti-slavery. He was naturally anti-slavery. He couldn't bear the sight of people being sold at auctions, something he witnessed as a young man, and he philosophically opposed the notion that someone who makes bread is not entitled to earn the money from making the bread, that he had to give the profits or the yield from his efforts to a master, to another person. That, he felt, went back to the tenets of the Declaration of Independence. The matter of racism and race is trickier. Lincoln was a man of the mid-19th century and grew up basically in all-white communities, was exposed to very few African Americans in his lifetime, and developed through the years, when he met Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and other models for a new order, he developed a different attitude. He changed over his own lifetime. Just look at the statements between 1858 and 1865, his last year alive. In 1858, he said he would never countenance the idea of black and white people intermarrying or black people serving on juries. By 1865, he was calling for the right of African Americans to vote, the first president to do so. So I think with Lincoln, it was an evolutionary process. He would be a racist certainly by 2013 terms, but by judging him by the standards of the 1860s, he was a rather enlightened white person.
Next up is Jerry, also calling from Indianapolis this morning, on our line for Democrats. You're on with Harold Holzer.
How you doing, sir? God bless you today.
Thank you.
My name is Jerry Ingram in Evans, Indiana. Your caller was talking about Lincoln agree with slavery. I've been collecting history about Lincoln since I was 21 years old. I'm 50 years. I got so much books about Lincoln. Lincoln helped the slaves. What the slaves went to, how the people was treated so bad. Lincoln stepped in and got them out of the situation we was in. That's what America's about right now. We need to quit talking about slavery and come together. The president trying to do the best he can. So the world got to come together. I love Lincoln. Lincoln is a good man. Lincoln did enough for the country. He did so much for the country. I got a book about Lincoln standing at the White House in the 18th century.
We're going to move on to Ron in Pontiac, Illinois, on our line for Republicans. Go ahead, Ron. Your question or comment for Harold Holzer.
Yeah, I'm wondering about the makeup of the Supreme Court at the time of the Dred Scott decision. I know Tawney was a South Carolinian. Who was appointed by Democrats? How many were Whig appointees? Were there any abolitionists on the Supreme Court? That kind of thing.
Okay, you're a little before my period of expertise. Tawney, by the way, was a Marylander, not a South Carolinian, lived on the southern shore of Maryland. I think there were predominantly Democratic appointees. There were no abolitionists on the Supreme Court in 1857. And of course, it was an overwhelming majority declaring that people of color could never be citizens of the United States and slaves could be transported anywhere. Lincoln, of course, changed that by appointing Republicans to the Supreme Court once he took office.
What are some of the main qualities about President Lincoln that leaders talk about, and are there any mistaken assumptions being made by some of the leaders today, either in Congress or at the White House, about President Lincoln and his legacy?
Well, the battle goes on about whether he belongs eternally to the Republican Party or whether his core values suggest that today he would be a Clinton and Obama Democrat. You know, that argument is there. Lincoln was definitely a spender and a taxer. I don't think that has really been accepted by a vast majority of political leaders or even historians. He imposed the first income tax. His policy was if America was fighting a war, we had to pay for it, and we had to pay for it as quickly as possible. There were bonds, but there was also an income tax, which was wildly objected to. I think what presidents glom onto is very personal often. President Bush said to me once that Abraham Lincoln used the kind of executive power without congressional approval that wasn't popular at the time, in his own era, but has been verified by the test of time. And he said, you see, my wiretapping and all of that is very Lincoln-esque. He said that directly. President Obama sees the transformative nature of Lincoln, the inspirational nature of Lincoln, and the ethos of living up to what Lincoln called the unfinished work that still challenges America. I think it's extraordinary that conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats can all find something in Lincoln to inspire them. I always say, although it's hard to say now that there's a big Coolidge book out, I know, but better they should emulate Lincoln than Coolidge. That's my general theory.
You bring up President Bush. President George W. Bush was at the White House doing a tribute to President Lincoln. Lincoln Seen and Heard. This took place on February 11th, 2005, and we're going to show our viewers a little bit of President Bush talking about his admiration for President Lincoln.
The Civil War was decided on the battlefield. The larger fight for America's soul was waged with Lincoln's words. In his own day, Lincoln set himself squarely against a culture that held that some human beings were not intended by their maker for freedom. And as president, he acted in the conviction that holding the Union together was the only way to hold America true to the founding promise of freedom and equality for all. And that is why, in my judgment, he was America's greatest president.
Harold Holzer, you were involved in that event at the White House on February 11, 2005. Talk to us a little bit about the perspective, the context under which this speech was made and what the relationship was between President George W. Bush and President Abraham Lincoln.
We had a program, Sam Waterston and I, that we took around the country for about 5 or 6 years called Lincoln Seen and Heard. Portraits of Lincoln made around the time of his greatest speeches, and the speeches themselves recited brilliantly by the great Sam Waterston.